Thank you, Dennis. Thanks very much for the introductions, and thank you everyone for organising the conference. Dennis, Katarina and Cosmin and Monica, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. As some of you know, I'm kind of coming from a slightly different angle. I'm in media studies, so I'm kind of looking at the design process and user experience of emerging mobile and digital technologies. So I'm mainly interested in the relationship between media and mobility, especially in the urban context. And one part is kind of around sound and music, and the other one is more around mobility, smart and intelligent mobility. Dennis just mentioned the new research centre that we have, and I just wanted to encourage people to maybe have a look at the website. And we're also inviting PhD students and postdocs and hopefully fellowships soon as well. So we're kind of trying to build up a group in Brighton and internationally. Just wanted to say that I'm very honoured to be here today, because when I first started looking at cycling in my own research, the kind of body of literature around cycling and society was really the work that resonated with me most strongly. And the first book, when was it? 2007, I think, is still very prominently on my bookshelf. So it's very nice to be here with all of you today. Okay. So I'm going to talk about smart velo mobility. And the area of smart cities and the Internet of Things are key areas of growth and attention for industry, policy and research. They are also of key importance for transport and mobility. However, cycling has not featured prominently in these developments. As an example, the European Commission's working document on the Internet of Things includes a whole big section on automated driving and smart mobility, but it doesn't reference cycling once. Compared to many other modes of smart modes of transport, such as intelligent cars, cycling is an important, sustainable and active mode of transport. But despite the multiple proven benefits of cycling, in most countries it remains marginalised compared to other modes of transport. And also, the majority of research and policies around cycling regard it as an offline activity and do not consider the networked aspects or the intelligent transport potential of velo mobility sufficiently, as this talk will show. However, it was really nice to see in the morning that there was some kind of talk around intelligent data, Strava things going on. So let's start with velo mobility, because I want to do two things with this talk. I want to develop the concept of smart velo mobility, and then I want to give you some understanding of the lived experience of smart velo mobility by drawing on some empirical material. So the term velo mobility relates to research around cycling and mobility that happens by bicycle, as all of you here are very well familiar with. Coughlin shows how bicycles are marginalised in transport planning in terms of physical infrastructure, etc. in many places. He develops velo mobility as a theoretical tool that can help us to understand the complexity of cycling through the city and which power relations are connected to the politics of transport planning. Drawing on this, velo mobility can also help us to understand the power relationships of cycling in smart cities and the politics of using intelligent technologies in transport planning with regards to different forms of mobility. Historically, in many Western and non-Western countries and cities, a modernist approach led to power relations that favour the motorised traffic and thus marginalised bicycle traffic, as we heard in some of the discussions in the morning. Now, this trend seems to continue with today's ICT development around mobility, as I argue today. For example, if physical spaces often exclude cyclists, the same is increasingly true for digital spaces and for code spaces that merge both physical and digital aspects. Coughlin and Rye's analysis draws on four key aspects of the politics of velo mobility, and this talk argues that all of them are also relevant for digital network developments. First, the quote, physical movement from A to B that concerns infrastructure for bicycling without obstacles and the creation of free and safe flow for cyclists, unquote. Getting from A to B, physical movement and issues of infrastructure are no longer only about physical infrastructure, but also about digital, intelligent, and smart infrastructure. Second, the quote, power relations in urban traffic space that need to consider power relations between the different groups that share the urban traffic space and creating spaces where cycling is not marginalized, unquote. And I would say that those power relations might be reinforced if cycling is regarded as an offline activity. Third is the positive representations of bicycling that entails a representation that is adapted and targeted to different groups of people and that creates a shared meaning of bicycling, as Coughlin and Rice say. And these representations of cycling should therefore also include smart and intelligent aspects. Fourth is the, quote, everyday practice and the experience of cycling, where infrastructure and bicycle planning must involve aspects of everyday life in order to make the cycling experience more pleasant and easier, unquote. And of course, this experience also changed if we include smart and intelligent technologies. This talk will touch on all four of those aspects, while the empirical material that I'll present later is mainly focused around the fourth aspect, so looking at the experience of network practices of cycling. So intelligent transport or intelligent transportation systems concern the use of network technologies for transport. There's kind of one way of talking about these technological developments, one set of discourses. And smart mobility is concerned with the same or similar technologies, but tends to have a much broader and more critical perspective on the use, experience, and politics emerging around them. And within mobility studies, smart mobilities are explored with regards to network people, things, and environments. I'm using Monica's work here that hope that a future mobility will entail producing, sharing, and collaboratively analyzing mobility data, utilizing computation that non-experts can make palpable, and where technologies augment human reasoning about and control of the mobile society people enact every day. But of course, as a flip side of the coin, there's also issues around potential surveillance and control. Smart mobility is also described by Elliott and Urry's digital network scenario that features new products and services, many based on smart software. The authors consider that, quote, we may thus be close to a tipping point where personal vehicles come to be combined with a smart infrastructure so as to develop an integrated network system rather than a series of separate vehicles. Transport mobility is often understood as being concerned with physical access and mobile objects, whereas virtual access and mobility is used for activities that replace physical travel, for example, video conferencing, Skyping, all those kinds of things. But Elliott and Urry's scenario highlights how virtual access and physical access are becoming an equally important aspect of mobility. And rather than conceptualizing transport as mobile physical objects, the focus is now on the network aspects, or the convergence of physical and digital networks. Civil liberties are really a key concern for those smart mobility scenarios, or really they're happening now, because they rely on the real-time sharing of large quantities of personal data as people and their movements become recorded and classified, and systems of tracking and tracing will involve noticeable changes to the very fabric of social life, freedom of movement, and lifestyles, as Elliott and Urry say. Now, I've got one more concept for you, then I'll move on to a little bit of lighter material, I hope. And this is the concept of code space, which I think is really interesting in relation to smart mobility and in relation to velo mobility. So this is work by Kitchen and Dodge, who are also running a big European-funded project on the programmable city. And their spatial approach to studying software shows how, quote, software matters because it alters the conditions through which society, space and time, and thus spatiality are produced, unquote. So they introduce the concept of code space that occurs, quote, when software and the spatiality of everyday life become mutually constituted. Unquote. Kitchen and Dodge distinguish between coded spaces and code space in terms of how functional a space remains without code. Quote, in coded space, software matters to the production and functioning of a space. But if the code fails, the space continues to function as intended, although not necessarily as efficiently or cost efficiently or safely. But this is not the case for code space. So they give the example of an airport check-in where you drop your luggage. So you go to the airport, you drop your luggage, you do the check-in. If the computer system is down, it actually ceases to be a check-in area and it turns into a waiting area. So the whole space, the whole function of the space is no longer given if the software side of it fails. And I would say, while it is still possible to ride most smart bikes even when the software fails, their functionality or safety will be reduced. For example, the assistant on an e-bike might not work. A smart lock might not secure the bike, or a docking station might not accept a returned bike. A code space example of cycling would be one where the space could actually not be produced at all or function without the software. For example, if we had a bike that only unlocks for riding if the owner's smartphone is in its vicinity. So drawing on these concepts and the literature that I introduced, I proposed the concept of smart velomobility. And it draws on velomobilities, the practices, systems and technologies of cycling, smart mobilities, the practices, systems and technologies of data mobilities and intelligent transport, as well as the code space concept, and is informed by the context of the Internet of Things and smart cities. Smart velomobility is then concerned with network practices, systems and technologies around cycling. It brings together attention to forms of cycling mobility, velomobility, with attention to smart, intelligent code aspects of mobility. And smart velomobility considers how network cycling practices and experiences fuse physical and digital aspects, including physical mobility, infrastructure, power relations, and representations, drawing on Coghlan and Rye's work. Smart velomobility happens when physical and digital aspects are co-created around and through cycling, and when velomobility data is produced, shared, and analyzed, both for individual riders and bikes and for network systems and fleets. So data is really quite central to this concept. Now I'm going to move on to the second part of the talk, talking about the empirical material around the experience of velomobility. And for this, I'm using material that is selected from post-trial interviews, focus groups, and surveys that were carried out as part of the Smart e-bike research project that we did in Brighton a few years ago. We used a fleet of 35 e-bikes in 2012 and 2013, and we lent these bikes to commuters for 6 to 8 weeks, and then we interviewed them afterwards. Now, to see how people were actually using the bikes, we developed a smart e-bike monitoring system that we put on all the bikes, and that was an open source platform that could tell us user data from the bikes, monitor location, rider control data, and other sensor input. So that was kind of an attempt to design some smart velomobility as well. Now I wanted to briefly show one of the videos from our website, if the Wi-Fi cooperates. Let's see how it's feeling at the moment. So we got all the data from all the bikes. So we knew where they were riding, and we could also see what type of assistance people were using, low, medium or high. and then we could map that beautifully on a map, which is, I don't think, a very networked environment here. So anyway, have a look. Oh, it's starting. Don't want any sound actually. Just leave that running in the background. For a little moment. So I'll leave that for now, but it basically shows how people were using the assistants in different ways in relation to the landscape and also in relation to their current journeys and their kind of different typologies almost of people using the bikes that we could see from the data. But specifically I want to talk about more some of the qualitative material. So, looking at the experience of smart velo mobility, I'm going to talk about 4 key themes that emerged from the research material. One is the intertwining of media and physical mobilities. One is the more individual interaction with the ride data. One is the experience around sharing the ride data, and one is more around feeling tracked and some privacy issues. So let's start with the first one. The smart mobility, ITS and code space concepts discussed earlier highlight the growing intertwining of media mobility and physical mobility, and this is confirmed by findings from the research material. The vast majority, 74%, of our trial participants report how they use a range of mobile media when walking, cycling, on public transport, or driving as part of their commute. And particularly interesting is one trial participant for whom the use of mobile media was a key factor in deciding on her mode of transport. So you can see here, if I'm walking or on the bus, then I can catch up on lots of things on my phone, because we can do everything on our phones now. But obviously on a bike, you've got to focus on riding your bike. And what is interesting is that this participant actually chose not to ride the bike because she couldn't use her phone. And in the future, modal choice might be even stronger influenced by the ability to engage with network media, underlining the importance of discussing networked cycling practices. Just over 50% of the 80 participants of the commuter trials reported that they went into the project website to see their ride data. So the data we collected with the monitoring system was not just for us to analyze, but also for people to log in on a website that looks very old school now, I know, but they could at least look at their trips and they would be visualized on a map. One rider terms the data and the visualizations as inspiring. So you can read here, when you look at the map, you get even more inspired to go for longer journeys, and you want to see how your path changes on the map. In this comment, we can see how the intertwining of mobility and data is reflected in people's emotional responses and how those relate to people's e-cycling behaviors. And just to say, most of the people we had on the trial didn't previously commute to work by bicycle, so they were kind of relatively new to everyday commuter cycling. And there were quite a few that were quite inspired by looking at some of the data, and that is of course also confirmed by some of the research around apps and cycling. The digital network scenario of smart mobility relies upon the real-time sharing of large quantities of personal data as, quote, people and their movements become recorded and classified, and it is viable that systems of tracking and tracing will involve noticeable changes to the very fabric of social life, as Elliot and Ari say. Unquote. So the sharing of mobility data by e-cyclists is an example of these changes in the social practices of everyday life. So we got lots of people talking about how they would post things on Facebook and share some of their data. But I think what was almost more interesting is that there were also quite a few people that were interested in other people's data. So several trial participants discussed how they would be interested to see other riders' data rather than or in addition to broadcasting or sharing their own data. And one rider longed to feel part of the group of riders, to know more about the fleet. So this quote here reads, "I wish I could see all of the bikes, all of the people, where they are, what they are doing." And this material suggests that networked cycling practices could also extend Albrecht's work and her discussion of the role of real and imagined cycling communities. These quotes show how sharing data is part of the smart velo mobilities and how network practices become an integral part of activities that were traditionally understood as offline, such as cycling. As the sharing of data is such an integral part of the network practices of smart mobility, this also means that there is a potential for surveillance and control, as smart mobility is not only about, quote, producing, sharing, and analyzing mobility data, but also about control of the mobile society people enact every day. This is Monica's work. So one trial participant was worried how the data collected and visualized by the monitoring system could be used by family members to monitor her mobility patterns. So she says, "I did look at the data in the first couple of weeks. My husband was really excited about looking at the data. And I started thinking, is he trying to find out where I was actually going? He was going, look, this is where you've been. I was a bit worried about his motives. I was thinking, why does he want to know where I go?" And there were a few other discussions around this as well. The kind of pride of wanting to show where they've been and how much cycling they've done, and then the worry about people being able to see, obviously, where they've been and when they've been. The next quote is an indication of how a rather abstract monitoring system that collects research data can be interpreted by users in a multitude of ways and how it shaped their actual mobility behavior. So this is another person saying, "This only affected me in the sense that I was probably more cautious because I knew that I could potentially be seen. Sometimes when I'm on my bike, like most cyclists, I do something that I'm not supposed to do, like turn the corner or run a red light. I knew that I can't do these things because it would show. I was probably a safer cyclist because I felt I was potentially being looked at." And this is really interesting because, of course, we could see none of these things. We could only see the GPS trail. But the idea that they were being monitored immediately affected the way how they would ride their bike. This only happened for one person. Nobody else expressed that, but I think it's a really interesting thought. And that might be more pronounced these days because more people now have apps for driving from their insurance companies. So there's a whole new way of how our driving and cycling and walking practices are really mediated. Right, so I should be concluding, I guess. So after introducing the smart velo mobility concept and showing the lived experience of it, it's now time for the talk's conclusion. This talk has illustrated the importance of cycling for smart mobility and intelligent transport, and vice versa, especially as mobility increasingly moves from coded spaces to code spaces, to come back to Kitchen and Dodge's concept, that no longer function without software. It has also shown how the physical and political exclusion of cycling in many cultures might now be joined by digital exclusion. And drawing on Coughlin and Rye's work, it is hoped that this talk's focus on cycling in the smart context and the new concept of smart velo mobility can contribute to research and policy conversations that help to avoid the exclusion of cycling from digital innovation, and instead work towards cycling being considered of equal importance to more established modes of transport, such as intelligent cars. A future research agenda for smart velo mobility could include further research on physical movement, infrastructure, power relations, representations, as well as everyday practices and experiences of networked cycling practices, systems and technologies. This might cover interaction with cycling apps, smart bike accessories such as locks, smart individual bikes, public or private networked fleets, infrastructure such as this beautiful Dutch path, and interactions and integration with other modes of transport. And all of these would need to consider issues of digital exclusion and questions around data and privacy. Another crucial area for future smart velo mobility research concerns policies and industry standards around the Internet of Things, smart city, and intelligent transport. Of course, if you look at any of these illustrations, you don't usually see a lot of bicycles in them. For example, these could be reviewed to highlight how, or rather how little, cycling is considered, and to identify opportunities to include cycling in future versions. Though a crude measure, a count of key terms gives us an indication. The European Commission's definition of a research and innovation policy leveraging cloud computing and Internet of Things combination, was great fun reading it, mentions car 14 times, it mentions vehicle 19 times, and it mentions cycling and bicycle 0 times. And there's only one reference to cycling at all in the document where shared bikes are mentioned. Now, Lyons argues that we are in the midst of a regime transition that is seeing the motor age becoming overshadowed by the digital age. And this talk explored how not just automobility, but also velomobility is transitioning in the digital age. Gilles underlines the importance of the information society for a transition towards low-carbon transport by naming intelligent transport systems as one of the key innovation niches. The implementation of intelligent transportation systems for automobile and public transport is, of course, rapidly moving from niche to mainstream socio-technical regime, while intelligent cycling is still in the niche stage and therefore has innovation potential towards more mainstream low-carbon transitions. This talk suggests that a focus by research, policy and industry on smart velo mobility could take the multiple benefits of cycling, such as better public health and well-being, reduced emissions, affordability, increased physical activity, lower congestion and emissions, and so on, to the intelligent, digital and smart age. Thank you.